In Trial of the Ancestors, we got passive skill tattoos, and they can be used in a lot of really interesting ways to min-max your builds. For example, let's say you need Explodey and don't want to give up a flask slot for Oriath's End, or simply can't afford the item. Well, stacking a bunch of Explodey tattoos is probably cheaper than a flask, and it definitely doesn't take up a flask slot. On the other hand, maybe you're short of a little resistance, fire res, cold res, even chaos res. Well, that tends to be pretty inexpensive because not that many people need a ton of extra resistances. Sure, you're maybe giving up life if you're giving up strength, but overall, it's usually a trade-off that you need to make because not being resistance capped is far more punishing than having a little bit less life. And speaking of, with Honored Tattoo of the Oak, you can get plenty more life as well. This is especially good for builds that have access to a lot of flat life, but don't have many increases to life due to their skill tree positioning. And then there's all the special tattoos for things like +1 gems, or let's say if you're playing a Righteous Fire Juggernaut, maybe you want maximum fire res or even maximum fire res and +1 endurance charge. There's quite a few options here, and with so many choices, well, how do you pick just a few? Because attributes are pretty valuable, and if you're taking up a suffix on your gear with attributes, then you're probably not putting resistances or damage modifiers there. Well, if you want to know more about how you should stack as many attributes as possible as part of making a build, then do be sure to get subscribed, as I'll be talking about that with a future character in a future video. But for now, let's start talking about how you fit more tattoos into a build you're already playing, using a theory-crafted example of a Righteous Fire Juggernaut, because if you're using Brass Dome, it already ensures that strength doesn't grant you life. Therefore, you lose a lot less from using Supreme Ostentation. Supreme Ostentation not only allows you to ignore attribute requirements, meaning you no longer need strength to use armor pieces or intelligence to use wands, but it does come with the small unfortunate downside of removing all the inherent bonuses from attributes. Luckily, on a Righteous Fire Juggernaut, you don't use the inherent attributes of Dexterity anyway, you don't use the inherent attributes of Int, and Brass Dome's already disabled Strength, which you would otherwise use. So there's no downside. Let's head over into POB and talk about this stuff in a little bit more detail. So first up, here is Supreme Ostentation. It is granted by Elegant Hubris, dedicated to commemorate Caspero. The exact seed doesn't matter here, this just happens to be one that converts the notables over to the left into something useful. If you're going to play a similar setup, then you'd also want to convert the notables into something useful. You do need Caspero, it does need to be an Elegant Hubris, and of course you need to allocate Supreme Ostentation, but you don't specifically need both of these notables, and the seed does not have to be identical. But zooming out a little bit, what you'll see is the tree is almost entirely tattooed. I say almost entirely because there's a couple nodes here which aren't, and that's because they're within the radius of Unnatural Instinct. Unnatural Instinct says that allocated small passives in radius grant nothing. Therefore, the two strength nodes grant nothing, and tattooing them would unfortunately be a waste. But it grants all the bonuses of unallocated small passive skills in radius, which is where you can do something very, very cool. You can stack Tattoo of the Namahu Makanga. I apologize, by the way, to anyone if I am mispronouncing that horribly incorrectly. Do be sure to let me know down in the comments. This gives +1 to maximum fire resistance, and it requires that no more than one adjacent passive skill is to be allocated. Luckily, if you're getting the bonuses from Unnatural Instinct, you don't have to allocate the passives, which leads to this fun little spooky tree, where you have 3 floating nodes and 1 trailing off into nowhere, granting 4% to maximum fire resistance, which is pretty darn powerful for a relatively low cost investment of 4 passives. Or I guess you could say 1 passive and a jewel socket, depending on how you're doing the math. Furthermore, you get increased maximum life, a little bit of resistance, about 16% increased armor, and some life regeneration based on your endurance charges. It's not a ton, but it's certainly better than nothing, and absolutely worth the investment in my opinion. So in this example, what are some of the cool and fun tattoos being used? There are quite a few Honored Tattoo of the Oak. This build has a relatively low increased life percentage, at about 154% after all the tattoos, but it would be closer to 100% without them. It also has a lot of very unnecessary intelligence and strength, since that does nothing and we don't need it to use our gear. So Honor Tattoo of the Oak becomes a really nice default. Furthermore, there are Tattoo of the Namahu Warmonger. Enemies you kill have a 2% chance to explode, dealing a tenth of their life as fire damage. Fire damage, of course, scales extremely well. It means you don't have to do something like Avatar Fire to convert stuff over and get all of your scaling bonuses. And stacking about 10 of these means it's pretty darn easy and consistent to have explosions as you're charging into packs. And there's also a few Honored Tattoo of a Dove, just kind of filling in for missing chaos resistance. I know this looks like it's pretty positive, but a lot of that's from the Progenesis, so a bit of extra chaos resistance is good, and in fact, a few of the Honored Tattoo of the Oak could also be swapped over to Dove for a little more chaos res and a little less life. That's kind of just how comfortable you are with taking chaos damage, having your flask up, etc. If you're primarily bossing, maybe fighting flawless Chiulas, I'd go for chaos res, but if you're mapping, your flask should be up anyway and it's not a big deal. Lastly, there is one Honored Tattoo of a Mountain. Not only does it give +1 max endurance charge, it's another 1% to maximum fire res, which is why this setup has 90% total fire resistance, making it quite tanky against Righteous Fire self-damage. And all of this investment into defense via tattoos means you get to have a very significant amount of damage. And let's talk about that next. In a lot of ways, character building in Path of Exile is a zero-sum game. This means whenever you're choosing to add defenses to your build, be it life, resistances, armor, or any other defensive measure, you're probably giving up some measure of damage for it. And you need to find the balance, or maybe thread the needle. If you have too much damage, sure, you'll kill everything if you get to hit it. That's exactly what the ZHP Ice Trappers do. But anything that hits you will also kill you. And in general, that isn't the most fun gameplay experience. On the other hand, if you are playing a solo self-found hardcore ruthless build, you might be able to tank absolutely everything. But you're not going to be very fast, and it will take you forever to kill a monster, which also generally doesn't lead to the greatest gameplay experience. So as part of finding a balance, you always want to understand what you're giving up. So for example, let's look at some rings from the earlier POB. One of the suffixes on this ring is damage over time multiplier, which adds a significant amount of DPS, but that could be chaos resistance. Or I suppose not on this ring, but on a different ring it could be. And on this ring, well, maybe it's hybrid, chaos and fire resistance. Fire resistance would be a bit of extra regen, and chaos resistance would mean the build is pretty much capped without Progenesis. But right here, it's damage over time multiplier, which significantly increases the build's DPS. On the other hand, this ring has lightning resistance, cold and lightning, damage over time multiplier. Here's where we could absolutely have chaos res, but something's being given up in order to achieve the end goal. That end goal is more damage. To maybe give us a little bit more of a tangible example, let's compare the defensive stats from the current build that I just showed you with my character from 321 Crucible. My character topped out at about 10 million DPS, which was totally fine for all content in the game, felt great in maps, could kill uber bosses, not necessarily the #1 go-to choice for an uber bosser, but it got the job done. And actually, my resistance to physical damage is pretty similar between the builds. The resistance to fire damage is high enough that in both cases it doesn't really matter, and so the only real difference is cold, lightning, and chaos, where my original setup is significantly better in that regard. However, this version has around 26 million DPS to the 10 million that I had before. So by using a really tanky 4th vow setup, I was able to get better defenses, and I was able to stay alive. This worked perfectly for me, because while I could kill uber bosses and did 1 or 2 times, my main focus was mapping. And if you're not doing delirious mapping, 10 million DPS is more than enough to kill everything super smoothly. But if I was going to do more bossing, or I was going to do delirium mapping, then I'd want the new setup with Supreme Ostentation, because at around 26 million DPS, it's going to be far more effective at killing things. It does give up a few quality of life things though. For example, Chaos Dots will wreck you much faster, and the Explodey from tattoos isn't quite as good as the Explodey from the flask. Furthermore, my resistances aren't overcapped by as much anymore. So if my charges are all stripped off and exposures added, I might accidentally burn to death. And I probably shouldn't be clicking some of the minus res alters. But that's just something that you have to weigh for yourself. Because maybe you'd never be clicking those minus res alters anyway, and maybe you're not too worried about your charges getting stripped off because everything that walks within a 5-mile radius of you burns to death instantaneously. But if you want to compare these builds for yourself, then I'll have both the POBs in my Discord. You can join using the link down in the description, then react to give yourself the community and notification roles before heading over to the Build Link archive channel. If you want to know more about tattoos and how to use them, I'll link to Maxwell's guide down in the description, and if you want to know more about Righteous Fire, I'll link to both my video guide from last league and the written guide that's up to date over at Maxwell GG. It doesn't really talk about the tattoos too much because in most cases you are going to be using tattoos to fill holes in your build, i.e. if you have a little bit too much intelligence, but you're missing a little bit of lightning res, that's a perfect application of a tattoo. Or if you're short just a bit of RMR and didn't manage to get it on, say, a corrupted jewel, that's another great use. But you can't really put that in a guide because your gear and my gear are probably going to vary slightly. So if you're not going with a Supreme Ostentation build, it's much more about what you happen to be missing at the time and where you actually have stats to spare. But links to all of those will be down in the description below. Personally, I hope that Trial of the Ancestors does end up going core. Right now, there's definitely things about tattoos which are maybe a little bit too powerful, and that kind of power is fun within a league, but would be a bit game-breaking or problematic if left in the game long-term. So I wouldn't be surprised if Trial of the Ancestors took a 3 or 6 month vacation before returning in full force. But the league mechanic's really cool, and it's one of a few out-of-map mechanics, I would say up there with Forbidden Sanctum, that feels like it would be a perfect $5 indie game over on Steam. It's a really nice self-contained gameplay loop, and sure, it would get old after you play it for 30 or 40 hours, but so do most of the $5 indie games on Steam. Doesn't mean they aren't a great experience while you play them. Speaking of, if you want to see my thoughts on some games that are available on Steam, some of which are in that lower price bracket, I'll link to a video from my second channel going over a bunch of indie games up in the card and down in the description below. And I'm also curious, what are your thoughts on Trial of the Ancestors and tattoos? Have you come up with any cool tech that you've used in a build, and would you like to see the league go core? Be sure to let me know down in the comments below. Of course, before I go, a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for their continued support. For as low as $1 a month, you can help make videos just like this possible, and at the $5 or higher level, you can see your name on the screen just like these fine folks here. But with that said, thank you for watching, I hope you learned something, and I'll see you again sometime soon.